Hello everyone, my name is Jasmine Inkabi and I'll be presenting on how smart bone plates can monitor fracture healing. So I'm sure that if not ourselves that have experienced a bone fracture, we know of someone that has had one themselves. And so usually what we see are these people walking around in either these casts or these braces after they've had this injury. But there's a lot of fractures that actually need surgical intervention in order for them to heal properly. And something like a cast or a brace isn't sufficient enough and doesn't provide enough structure for the fracture to heal properly. And there's two different models that I'll go through in a moment. So the general outline of this presentation, I'll be going through some in-clinic methods of fracture repair and talking about the limitations that come with the methods that they use. And then I'll be going through how fractures actually heal in the body, and then talking about the electrical equivalent to the tissues and the correlation between what the electrical terminology means and how that relates to the actual healing of the fracture. And then I'll go through the hypothesis of this experiment, and then we'll look at the actual experimentation, starting with the materials and methods, then we'll move to results, and then we'll revisit the hypothesis knowing what we know about the data that was collected in this study, and then I'll go through some take-home messages. So to start, musculoskeletal injuries are one of the most disabling conditions in the US, and there are 12 to 15 million cases of bone fractures per year, and that's a lot. And currently in clinics, there's a lack of standardized methods for assessment of bone fracture union, and union just means the proper healing of a fracture to where it becomes a fully functioning normal bone as it should be. And the current in-clinic methods are either radiographic imaging or a physical exam. And there are many limitations that come with this, even when looking at radiographic imaging, where if you go in for a plain X-ray, they correlate poorly with bone strength, and there's an inaccurate definition of the union. When looking at the imaging, it's hard to determine how the union will turn out, and there's also a difficulty of determining what stage of repair the fracture is in, and I'll be going through those different stages soon. But even going a step up from a plain X-ray and using something like a CT scan or a dual energy X-ray or ultrasound, there's still limitations to where there's a lot of cost for the clinic, and also there's the dose of radiation that a patient will be exposed to, which isn't good. So the point of this experiment was to utilize a different method that can essentially be more effective in assessing bone fracture union as the fracture heals. So how a fracture actually heals, there's two different ossification pathways. Ossification being the deposition of bone, and the two types are intramembranous, being direct, and endochondrial, which is indirect. And so the first stage of bone repair begins right after you sustain the injury, and a hematoma forms, which triggers an inflammatory response in the body. And then stage 2, direct and indirect ossification start to happen in a parallel fashion. And direct ossification is put into the parts of the fracture where there's still stability, and fully functioning bone can be directly deposited onto those areas, where indirect ossification has to go through a cartilage intermediate. And that cartilage is being put into the less stable areas of the fracture. And then moving on to stage 3, cartilage is turning into trabecular bone. And what cartilage is made up of chondrocytes, which are the cells of the cartilage. And these chondrocytes mature and they promote materialization when they mature into osteoblasts, which are the cells of trabecular bone. And so from stage 3 moving into stage 4, trabecular bone turns into cortical bone, where cortical bone is fully functioning, completely healed. And this happens when osteoblasts secrete bone matrix and are then in turn referred to as osteocytes. So looking at tissue from an electrical perspective, we can split its contents into two different categories. The first being resistive and the second, which is capacitive. And the resistive category is the more ion-rich substances where electricity will be allowed to flow, being the intra and extracellular matrices. And then capacitive would be the parts of the tissue offering more resistance to the electricity flowing, which would be the double layer membrane of all of the cells present. So looking at this equation here to the side, Z being the complex impedance, which in this case the complex is the tissue, and the impedance being the overall resistance of electricity, is equal to the resistance coming from the resistive components and then plus the reactance being the resistance from electricity of the capacitive component. And this method here is called electrical impedance spectroscopy, where we can send electrical signals into a piece of bone, and that electrical current will be processed through sensors and electrodes, and we can determine just how much tissue is present in a certain area of the bone that we're looking at. So, knowing how electrical impedance spectroscopy works, the researchers hypothesized that EIS, electrical impedance spectroscopy, measurements would correlate well with biological indicators of healing, such as callus composition, X-ray radiographs, and micro-CT scans, which really just means that the results that the EIS comes up with should correlate properly with whatever results that a CT scan or an X-ray would show you if you went into a clinic. So the two models that I referred to earlier when stabilizing a fracture surgically are the external fixture model and then the bone plate model, where in the external fixture model, on the image at the top, you can see that the fracture is being stabilized from the outside of the leg, while in the bone plate model, the fracture is being stabilized with plates and screws that are actually attached to the bone itself to provide a proper structure so that the bone heals properly. So for this study, mice ranging in age from 12 to 20 weeks were used, as well as they weighed 22 to 33 grams. And they were chosen from this category just so that it would be sure that there wasn't any predisposition or an expected difference in fracture healing, so that we could get a proper playing field for the mice. So the mice that participated in the external fixture model, there were 2 different defects that were given to the mice. 6 of them were given fracture gaps of 0.5 millimeters wide, and then 5 of them were given fractures that were 2 millimeters wide. And then for those in the bone plate model, 10 mice were given a fracture with a single snip of a saw that resulted in a fracture gap of less than 0.25 millimeters. And then there were control mice that did receive the bone plates and the screws, but did not have a fracture at all, so that we could see the way that they were developing as well. So for the external fixture model, Measurements of impedance were done on days 0, starting on day 4, and then sporadically until day 28, and the same going for the bone plate model, except the starting date after surgery was day 2, and that section of the study lasted 26 days. As the days went on throughout the study, for the external fixture model, mice were euthanized on days 3, 4, 7, 10, 14, 25, and 28, so that by the end, the data would show a progression of healing. And then mice participating in the bone plate model were euthanized on day 12 and 26, where these days signify the transitions between stage 2 and 3 in bone repair, and then stage 3 and 4, where stage 2 and 3 is cartilage turning into trabecular bone, and then stage 3 and 4 being trabecular bone turning into cortical bone. So this top image on the left, shows the actual models used for the mice for the external fixture, and then also the entire system for the setup of the bone plate model. And then the B parts of these images show the actual sensors and electrodes that were also implanted into the mice that would collect the electrical data. And this image B on the left was used for mice that had a 2mm gap, and this image E was the sensors implanted in the mice with the 0.5mm gap. So impedance measurements were taken, 2 points were taken 2 times a week for the fracture model mice, and then 3 times a week for the bone plate model mice. And the way that the electrical data was collected was a machine emitted an 100 millivolt sine wave, and 100 millivolts was chosen because that was in the threshold where the machine can get a good, clear reading of what was happening in the body, but also we could avoid the electrolysis of water. And that measurement was taken at these listed frequencies. And then after all of these frequencies were taken, as the mice were being euthanized, the tissue was radiographed and a CT scan was taken of the bone, and then the tissue was allowed to sit for a total of 48 hours and stained for histological analysis. And then after all of that is said and done, the tissue was given a RUSS score and a clinical diagnosis by 5 different surgeons. And RUSS stands for Radiographic Union Scale in Tibia Fractures, where a score of 1 would be that there's no callus, meaning there's no formation of cartilage going on, and then the highest score of 4, where the bone is completely healed and there's no sign of a fracture at all. And the clinical diagnosis refers to either if the bone can be considered a union, which is completely healed, a non-union where healing hasn't occurred or has healed wrong, and then a suspected non-union where it's kind of in the gray area of we're unsure how the progression of this healing will go. So looking at the results, we can compare the histology between A, which is a well-healing mouse, and then E, which is a poor healing mouse. And the different colors you see here are yellow for trabecular bone, blue for cartilage, purple for fibrous tissue, and then red for cortical bone, and black and white for bone marrow. So starting in A, which is the well-healing mouse, we can see that there's a large content of trabecular bone, which means that this mouse is in stage 3 of healing. And then looking at E, which is the poor healing mouse, we can see that there's a lot of fibrous tissue and only a small bit of cartilage. And looking at this amount of fibrous tissue, we can see that the actual proper healing of the fracture hasn't taken off, even though it's been a total of 26 days after the injury has been inflicted on these mice. And looking at B and F, these are just very magnified images of square areas knocked off in A and E that show the electrode surrounded by all this different tissue in the respective mice. And then C is an X-ray radiograph, while D is a CT scan of the bone in the well-healing mouse. And then G and H represent the same thing in the poor healing mouse. And so looking at these different images, we can see that in the well-healing mouse, the actual visible fracture gap is much thinner than the fracture gap that is seen in the poor healing mouse, which is thicker, showing that there hasn't been much healing. Looking at I, we can see that the R, which is the resistance from the intra and extracellular matrices against, R has been normalized to day 2, which was the first day of measurement for the impedance. Looking at J, X is the resistance coming from the capacitive component of the tissue, which is the bilipid membrane. And then R2T is the extracellular matrix itself. And so these blue lines are all well-healing mouse, and we can see that as resistance increases and as the days after the fracture have happened, the resistance increases, and that this is showing that they're healing well and more consistently than the mice depicted in red, where they're not healing very well. Purple is the mice that are kind of in the gray area, and we can't quite determine if the fracture will result in a union or a non-union yet. And then we have the brown mice, which are simply the control. So looking at this table and going back to the Rust scores that I talked about earlier, we can see that the well-healing mice have the highest Rust scores. The poor healing mice have the lowest, and those in the middle have the middle scores, and these colors correspond to the same colors that were shown in the graph in the previous slide. So these surgeons looked at the histology of all of these different mice and assigned them either put them in the category of either union, non-union, or suspected non-union. And giving the Rust scores, the well-healing mice, of course, got the highest scores, meaning that a union was present, and then the low-healing mice receiving the lowest scores received mostly non-union labels. And then paying closer attention to the last 3 columns to the left, we can see that there's a comparison of the actual results that would be given to a fracture based on a CT scan, stereology, and then the EIS that was done in this study. And for the most part, we can see that the results do match up. And the point of this study was to the point of this study was to see if there's a correlation between the EIS data and also the CT scan data or the X-ray data. So this image on the left is basically a summary of the previous data, where again, R is the resistance from the intra or extracellular matrices. And so shown on the x-axis are bone volume and over total volume, bone mineral density, and then trabecular number and thickness. And we can see that as these go up, the resistance also goes up. And this is actually a very good sign because we can see that the EIS is actually working how it should, and we should remind ourselves that as the resistance goes up, that just signifies that there's more tissue in the area. So looking back at the hypothesis, which was EIS measurements would correlate well with biological indicators of healing, such as callus composition, X-ray radiographs, and micro-CT scans, we can say that the hypothesis was supported by the data that was gathered. So all in all, EIS sensors quantify what X-rays can't, where I had talked about how X-rays do not show the different stages of repair, and X-rays actually aren't quite helpful until stages 3 and 4, where actual healing is coming to a close, which isn't good because we need to know how a fracture is doing in order to take the correct protocol for it to heal properly. And then we can know that sensor data enhances current clinical care in the way that this provides some kind of insight to the way that a fracture is healing before the other kinds of tests work in a clinic. And using EIS data regularly on a patient with a fracture can provide a physician with a healing trajectory in order to know where the actual healing of this fracture is going in specifics with the current patient that they are working with. Because although people do get fractures, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach that can be used, because based on different factors like age or previous conditions, the healing trajectory for person to person will be different. And so having a healing trajectory made with EIS sensor data would be really helpful. And with that being said, that's the end of my presentation, and thank you for listening.